Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Brad Musil, and this is a reading of The Utility of Religion, Mill, Nietzsche, and James. This is going to be section B of part 3 of chapter 1, John Stuart Mill and Utility of Religion. Again, this is section B, Mill's case for why supernatural religions are not necessary for securing personal happiness. First, Mill argues that supernatural religion is not necessary for personal happiness, or, more specifically, the satisfaction of the particular psychological desires it is associated with. He points out that societies have survived and thrived without being significantly influenced by, or in some cases, being entirely devoid of, supernatural beliefs. Quote, history, he writes, so far as we know it, bears out the opinion that mankind can perfectly well do without the belief in heaven, end quote. Footnote 147 cites the source. Consider once more the case of the ancient Greeks, who largely functioned without any significant consideration of such belief. Footnote 148. On this point, Mill says, quote, the Greeks had anything but a tempting idea of a future state, end quote. As evidence, he cites Homer's Odyssey, wherein Achilles suggests that he would sooner be a slave on earth than be a king in the afterlife. End of footnote 148. Despite this, quote, we neither find that the Greeks enjoyed life less, nor feared death more than other people, end quote. Footnote 149 cites the source. Similarly, Mill thinks that many Buddhist societies provide us with more proof that it is possible for human beings to subsist and be happy without supernatural beliefs, insofar as he argues that the ultimate reward Buddhism offers is not another life in the hereafter, but rather cessation of existence altogether. Footnote 150 cites the source. Moreover, Mill argues that the psychological needs satisfied by supernatural religions can be fulfilled by other means. Specifically, he believes earthly substitutes can accomplish the same effects. In support of this point, he cites two specific examples, patriotism and his own Religion of Humanity. Mill argues that love of one's country is, quote, sufficient to inspire large masses and long successions of mankind with an enthusiasm capable of ruling the conduct, the coloring the whole life end quote. Footnote 151 cites the source. In support of this conclusion, Mill points to the Romans' historical allegiance to Rome, which he characterizes as follows. Quote, Rome was to the entire Roman people for many generations as much a religion as Jehovah was to the Jews. Much more, for they never fell off from their worship as the Jews did from theirs. And the Romans, otherwise a selfish people, with no very remarkable faculties of any kind except the purely practical, derived nevertheless from this one idea a certain greatness of soul, which manifests itself in all their history where the idea is concerned and nowhere else, and has earned for them the large share of admiration, in other respects not at all deserved, which has been felt for them by the most noble-minded persons from that time to this. End of the quote. Footnote 152 cites the source. Mill himself offers a substitute for supernatural religions in the form of his Religion of Humanity. Mill's own Religion of Humanity is no doubt inspired by Auguste Comte, who was the first to construct a religion of humanity and a thinker whom Mill greatly admired and became close friends with. Reflecting on their relationship, Carr suggests that, quote, Mill liked Comte's religion not primarily because it glorified the human race, but because it was a religion without a God. End quote. Footnote 153 cites the source. And he points out that Mill, in return, quote, outlined to Comte a complete strategy for the introduction of atheism into England. End quote. Footnote 154 cites the source. Mill's Religion of Humanity redirects the exalted feelings that would otherwise be directed towards an afterlife, as they are in the case of supernatural religions, onto the entire duration of human existence and the prospects of our human species. Like patriotism, Mill's Religion of Humanity draws attention to elements of our earthly life, and not to a future existence. As Carr suggests, quote, what he wanted still was a religion which, instead of carrying one beyond the physical world, derived its psychological power from an idealization of earthly life, end quote. Footnote 155 cites the source. In juxtaposition with patriotism, however, his Religion of Humanity enlarges the scope of our earthly concern, encouraging not love of one's country, but love of one's species. At first, this might sound like a tall order, considering the incessant worldly conflicts that have marred humankind throughout history. However, Mill counters by pointing out that, quote, if persons could be trained, as we see they were, not only to believe in theory that the good of their country was an object to which all others ought to yield, but to feel this practically as the grand duty of life, so also may they be made to feel the same absolute obligation towards the universal good. End quote. Footnote 156 cites the source. Thus, Mill argues that we can infer that his religion of humanity is possible from the fact that patriotism has proven to be effective. What's more, the psychological desires satisfied by supernatural religions are satisfied by the religion of humanity, quote, in as eminent a degree and in as high a sense as by the supernatural religions, even in their best manifestations, and far more so than in any of their others. End quote. Footnote 157 cites the source. Ultimately, Mill remains convinced that all are capable of, quote, identifying their feelings with the entire life of the human race, end quote. Footnote 158 cites the source, and that the religion of humanity is, quote, capable of fulfilling every important function of religion, end quote. Footnote 159 cites the source. In Civilization and its Discontents, Freud makes similar remarks in his discussions regarding the import of science, implying that it too might help serve our purposes here. According to Freud, when confronted with inevitable restrictions on his or her pleasure, the civilized individual must succumb to what Freud identifies as the reality principle, and he or she is forced to modify his or her claim to happiness as a result. Footnote 160 cites the source. In Freud's estimation, our most profitable response to this reality principle is to become, quote, a member of the human community, end quote, and, quote, with the help of a technique guided by science, end quote, footnote 161 cites the source, collectively attempt to subjugate nature for the benefit of each individual. Footnote 162. This sounds very reminiscent of Mill. Recall, for instance, the quotation from Mill's Nature cited earlier in Part 1. End of footnote 162. Thereby aspiring to attain the optimal amount of pleasure possible given the reality of the situation. In fact, through this process of subjugation of nature, the individual will, quote, almost become a god himself, end quote. Footnote 163 cites the source. Anticipating the objection that, despite the advances of science, many of us are still not happy, Freud cites specific scientific accomplishments, railway, telephone, longer life, etc., footnote 164 cites the source, and urges his reader to reflect on the enhancements and joys these accomplishments have nevertheless made possible. Scientific and technological advancements, Freud writes, quote, are an actual fulfillment of every or almost every fairy tale wish, end quote. Footnote 165 cites the source. I will say much more about the relationship between religion and science and how this relationship affects considerations of the utility of religion in Chapter 2, where I outline Nietzsche's thoughts on these issues. So that was, again, Section B of Part 3 of Chapter 1, John Stuart Mill and Utility of Religion, from The Utility of Religion, Mill, Nietzsche, and James. Thanks.